Montana Territory, 1885. The first snow of December settled like a funeral shroud over Jackson Baxter's small cattle ranch. He stared at the white expanse from his porch, hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold, just like the life he'd carved out for himself in this remote corner of the frontier. At 26, Jack was already known throughout Eagle Creek as a man who kept to himself, dependable with cattle, quick with a lasso, but as closed off as the mountain passes after a blizzard. Talking to folks only complicates things, he muttered to his faithful blue heeler, Chance. Out here, a man's best chance is to mind his own business and keep moving forward. The dog cocked his head, unconvinced by a philosophy his master had been repeating since arriving in Montana 3 years ago. After watching his parents' loving marriage end with his mother's death from frontier fever and his father's subsequent descent into whiskey and an early grave, Jack had concluded that attachment was a liability. The frontier demanded everything a man had. There was no room for distraction, especially not the kind that came with soft eyes and softer words. His gaze drifted to the neighboring homestead, where thin wisps of smoke curled from the chimney. The Miller place had stood empty for months after old Samuel Miller passed, but rumor had it his daughter-in-law had arrived from back east to claim it. A widow, they said. Jack had deliberately avoided town on the day the stage arrived, not wanting to get pulled into the inevitable welcoming committee Eagle Creek formed whenever a new face appeared. Not our concern, Chance, he said firmly, though something like curiosity stirred as he watched that distant smoke rise against the gray winter sky. We've got 50 head to move to the south pasture before this storm gets worse. But as he turned to saddle his horse, he couldn't help but wonder about the woman who'd choose to face a Montana winter alone rather than stay in civilization. It took a certain kind of courage or desperation to do that, the kind he understood all too well. Katherine Adler had been staring at the wood pile for 20 minutes, the axe heavy in her gloved hands. At 22, she was already intimately acquainted with the hard reality that life rarely went according to plan. The telegram informing her of her husband Michael's death had arrived just 6 months after their wedding, leaving her a widow before she'd even finished unpacking their Boston apartment. Then came the letter from Michael's father, Samuel Miller, inviting her to Montana. "There's land here," he'd written, "and a future for you still." But by the time she'd gathered the courage to accept, another telegram arrived. Samuel, too, had passed. Still, she'd come anyway, determined to claim the only thing left to her, a homestead she'd never seen and the promise of a life she would build entirely on her own. People only leave you in the end, she reminded herself, positioning a log on the stump. The only person you can count on is yourself. Her first swing missed entirely, the force of it nearly toppling her slender frame into the snow. Katherine straightened, blowing a strand of honey-blonde hair from her face. 3 weeks in Montana Territory had taught her more about survival than 22 years in Boston, but she still had so much to learn. Her dark blue woolen dress was already patched at the elbows, her hands blistered beneath her gloves. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn, axe raised defensively. A rider approached through the falling snow, tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders dusted white. As he drew closer, she could make out a young face partially shadowed by his hat brim, handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw showing just a hint of stubble. "Ma'am," he called, reining his horse to a stop at a respectful distance. "Didn't mean to startle you." Katherine lowered the axe, but maintained her grip. "Can I help you?" "Name's Jackson Baxter. I run cattle on the neighboring spread." He gestured vaguely westward. "Noticed you struggling with that wood. Storm's coming in faster than expected. You won't make it through the night without more fuel than that." She lifted her chin. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Baxter, but I'm managing just fine." Something like respect flickered across his face. "No doubt you are, Mrs. Adler." "Katherine Adler." She hesitated. "Samuel Miller was my father-in-law." Jack nodded slowly. "Sorry for your loss. Sam was a good man." "I never had the chance to meet him," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Jack studied her for a long moment, then dismounted in one fluid motion. "If you don't mind, Mrs. Adler, I could help with that wood. Not charity, just being neighborly. These Montana winters can kill if you're not prepared." Katherine wanted to refuse. Every instinct told her to send this stranger away, to prove she could manage alone. But the temperature was dropping, and behind her stood a cabin with walls that seemed to grow thinner with each passing night. "I would be grateful for the help, Mr. Baxter," she finally said, "though I insist on learning how to do it properly myself." A smile flickered briefly across his face, the first she'd seen, transforming his features from merely handsome to something that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "Fair enough," he said, removing his gloves. "First lesson, you're holding that axe all wrong." 3 hours later, Katherine had a woodpile that would last a week and hands that felt like they might never stop throbbing. She stood in her doorway, watching as Jack loaded the last split logs onto her porch. "I can't thank you enough," she said. "Would you stay for some coffee? It's the least I can offer." Jack hesitated, glancing at the darkening sky. The invitation tugged at something he'd kept carefully dormant. "Thank you, but I should get back before the storm hits full force." Disappointment flickered across her face, quickly masked. "Of course, I understand." As he mounted his horse, Jack found himself saying, "I'll ride by tomorrow. Make sure you weathered the night all right. You needn't trouble yourself." "No trouble," he said, tipping his hat. "Just being a good neighbor." As he rode away through thickening snow, Jack frowned at himself. This wasn't like him, getting involved, making promises. Katherine Adler, with her determined chin and honey-blonde hair, wasn't his concern. Yet something about the way she stood so straight-backed despite the obvious exhaustion in her eyes had stirred something protective in him. "Just checking on a neighbor," he told Chance when he arrived home. Nothing more to it than that. But that night, as the wind howled around his cabin and he added logs to his own fire, Jack found himself glancing repeatedly toward the window that faced east, toward the Miller. No, the Adler place now, wondering if her fire burned steady, if she was warm enough in that old cabin that had stood empty too long. It was just common decency, he assured himself. Out here, neighbors looked out for each other. It didn't mean anything more than that. The blizzard that hit that night was the worst in recent memory. Katherine huddled beneath every blanket she owned, listening to the wind shriek around the cabin corners like something alive and hungry. Twice she had to rise to add wood to the fire, and twice she thanked Providence, or Jackson Baxter, for the ample supply. When morning came, the world outside her window had vanished, replaced by a wall of white. She'd barely managed to dig a path to the chicken coop when the sound of shovels striking snow alerted her to Jack's presence. "Mr. Baxter," she called, squinting through the brightness. "I didn't expect to see anyone for days." Jack paused in his work, leaning on his shovel. "Promised I'd check on you, didn't I?" He looked tired, as though he'd been up most of the night. "Had to dig my way here from the road. That must have taken hours." He shrugged, said I'd come. Something warm unfurled in Katherine's chest at the simple statement. In her experience, men's promises had proven as insubstantial as morning mist. Yet here stood Jackson Baxter, who had apparently battled his way through a blizzard simply because he'd said he would. "Would you like to come in? I've got coffee and biscuits." This time, he accepted. Inside, Katherine watched as Jack removed his hat, revealing dark hair in need of a trim. He seemed too large for her small cabin, his broad shoulders and tall frame making the space shrink around him. Yet there was nothing intimidating about his presence. Rather, she felt safer with him there, as though the howling wilderness outside had retreated a few crucial steps. "It's not much," she said, gesturing to the sparse furnishings. "I sold most of what I had in Boston to afford the journey here." Jack accepted the coffee she offered. "It's a good cabin. Solid foundation. Samuel built it to last." "Did you know him well?" "Well enough. He helped me when I first came to Eagle Creek." Jack's eyes took on a distant look. "Showed me where to place my fences, which valleys held water year-round." "Why did you come here?" Katherine asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. Jack's expression closed slightly. "Same reason as most, I expect. Wanted land of my own, space to breathe. And before that, Texas." The single word carried weight, like a door closing. Nothing worth talking about there. Katherine recognized the boundaries in his voice. She had drawn enough of her own. "I understand. The past is often best left buried." Something shifted in his eyes then, a flicker of recognition. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. "That it is." They finished their coffee in companionable silence, and when Jack finally rose to leave, Katherine found herself reluctant to see him go. "I'll be by again tomorrow," he said, settling his hat back on his head. Make sure your roof's holding up under all this snow. You don't have to. I know, he interrupted gently. But I will anyway. After he left, Katherine sat at her small table, staring into the fire. For the first time since arriving in Montana, the silence felt different, less like abandonment and more like pause. True to his word, Jack returned the next day, and the day after that. What began as checking on a neighbor during a bad storm gradually transformed into a routine. He would arrive mid-morning, help with whatever task needed doing, repairing a broken window latch, showing her how to bank the fire to last through the night, teaching her to identify which trees made the best firewood, and she would invite him in for coffee or a simple meal. At first, their conversations remained safely impersonal. Weather predictions, livestock concerns, the best way to keep water from freezing in the pump. But as December deepened toward Christmas, something else deepened between them as well. Why did you really come to Montana? Jack asked one evening as they sat by her fire, the remains of a rabbit stew between them. Most widows would have stayed back east with family. Katherine stared into the flames. I have no family left. My parents died when I was 16. I worked as a seamstress until I met Michael. She twisted the simple gold band she still wore. We were married 6 months when he enlisted. He never came home. I'm sorry. When Samuel's letter came, offering me a place here, it seemed like a sign, a chance to belong somewhere again. She looked up, meeting his eyes. Even if that somewhere was a place I'd never seen. Jack nodded slowly. Brave thing to do. Not brave. Desperate, perhaps. She attempted a smile. What about you? You never mentioned family. Jack's jaw tightened. Lost my mother to fever when I was 16. My father to whiskey 2 years later. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. He set his cup down with finality. Taught me an important lesson, though. Out here, a man's better off relying on himself. Caring too much just gives life more ways to hurt you. Katherine studied him in the firelight. This man who checked her roof after every snowfall, yet claimed to believe in self-reliance above all else. If that's true, she said quietly, then why do you keep coming back here? The question hung between them, unanswered. Jack stood abruptly. It's getting late. I should head back before the temperature drops further. Katherine walked him to the door. Thank you for the company, Jack. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and something flickered in his eyes at the sound of it on her lips. For a heartbeat, she thought he might say something more, might breach the careful distance he maintained despite their growing friendship. Instead, he simply nodded and stepped out into the cold December night. 2 days before Christmas, Jack rode into Eagle Creek for supplies. The general store buzzed with holiday preparations, and he found himself lingering over a display of items he'd normally ignore. Ribbons and small trinkets, colorful paper for wrapping gifts, delicate ornaments of painted glass. Looking for something special, Jack? Martha Wilson, the storekeeper's wife, appeared beside him. Just the usual supplies, he said gruffly. Martha smiled knowingly. I hear you've been spending quite a bit of time out at the Miller place. Or I suppose it's the Adler place now. Jack's shoulders stiffened. Just being neighborly. Of course. Martha reached past him, selecting a small glass ornament shaped like a bird. Katherine mentioned she's never had a proper Montana Christmas. Shame for anyone to be alone at the holidays. Jack glanced sharply at her. When did you speak with Mrs. Adler? She was in yesterday, buying some yarn and flour. Sweet girl. Been through a lot, from what I gather. Martha placed the ornament in his hand. This would look lovely on a little tree, don't you think? Birds symbolize hope. New beginnings. Before Jack quite knew what was happening, he had purchased not only his usual supplies but also the glass bird, a length of red ribbon, a small tin of peppermint candies, and, most surprising to himself, a delicate silver comb inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Just being neighborly, he repeated to himself as he rode home through gently falling snow. But even chance, trotting beside his horse, seemed to cast a doubtful look his way. That night, Jack woke suddenly, his heart pounding. He'd been dreaming of his mother, not as she was during the fever that took her, but as she had been during the Christmas celebrations of his childhood. In his dream, she had looked at him with sad eyes. Why are you so alone, Jackson? She had asked. This isn't what I wanted for you. Unable to return to sleep, he rose and stoked the fire. His gaze fell on the small package containing the silver comb, wrapped awkwardly in brown paper and tied with the red ribbon. What was he doing? Katherine Adler wasn't his concern. She was a neighbor in need of occasional help, nothing more. Yet he couldn't deny the way his days had begun to orient themselves around the hours he spent at her cabin. The way he found himself listening more carefully to her stories about Boston, watching the expressions that crossed her face, noticing the determined set of her shoulders when she tackled a new task. "This can't lead anywhere good," he told Chance. The dog tilted his head, unconvinced. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of pine and the distant howl of wolves. Jack made a decision. Tomorrow, he would ride to Katherine's place one last time. He would give her the gift, a simple Christmas kindness from one neighbor to another, and then he would pull back, reset the boundaries he'd allowed to blur. It was better this way, safer, for both of them. Katherine hummed quietly as she hung sprigs of pine around her cabin. It wasn't much in the way of decoration, but it brought the scent of Christmas indoors. She had even managed to bake a small cake with precious sugar she'd purchased in town, planning to share it with Jack when he next visited. If he visited. 2 days had passed since she'd last seen him, and she tried to ignore the disappointment that grew with each passing hour. She had become too accustomed to his presence, too dependent on their conversations for company. It was a dangerous pattern, one she had promised herself to avoid. He has his own life, his own concerns, she reminded herself firmly. And so do you. Still, when hoofbeats sounded outside her cabin shortly after noon, Katherine couldn't help the way her heart leaped. She smoothed her hair, worn loose today instead of in its usual practical bun, and adjusted her dress, a deep green wool that brought out the hazel in her eyes. Jack stood on her porch looking uncharacteristically uncertain, a small package in his gloved hands. "Mrs. Adler," he greeted her formally. "Mr. Baxter," she returned, matching his tone while trying to ignore the sting of his reversion to formality. "Please, come in." He hesitated. "I can't stay. Just wanted to bring this by." He extended the package. "For Christmas." Katherine accepted it, surprised. "You didn't have to. It's nothing much," he interrupted. "Just a small token of neighborly appreciation." "Thank you." She stepped back, gesturing inside. "Won't you at least come in for a moment? I've made cake." Again, that hesitation. Then, as if against his better judgment, Jack nodded and followed her inside. The cabin looked different, Katherine realized, seeing it through his eyes. She had added little touches over the weeks, a quilt draped over the rocking chair, curtains at the windows made from fabric she'd brought from Boston, the pine boughs lending color and fragrance to the room. It looked more like a home now, less like a shelter. "Would you like to open it?" Jack asked, nodding toward the package still in her hands. Carefully, Katherine untied the ribbon and unwrapped the paper. The silver comb caught the firelight, sending prisms dancing across the walls. "Jack," she breathed. "It's beautiful. Martha Wilson said you might like it," he said quickly, as if to diminish his role in the selection. "For your hair." Katherine looked up at him, something warm expanding in her chest. "It's the most thoughtful gift I've received in a very long time." "Thank you." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something electric passed between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had formed during these winter weeks, deeper than either wanted to admit. Jack looked away first. "I should go. Got cattle to check before nightfall." "Of course." Katherine set the comb carefully on the table. "But wait, I have something for you as well." She retrieved a small package from beside the fireplace, a knitted scarf in deep blue wool, made during the long evenings after Jack had left. "You've been so kind to me," she said, extending it to him. "I wanted to thank you properly." Jack accepted the scarf, his fingers brushing hers. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to." She smiled. "Besides, practical gifts are acceptable even between mere neighbors, aren't they?" Something flickered in his eyes at her gentle emphasis on mere. Katherine, whatever he might have said, was cut short by a sudden commotion outside, the panicked whinny of his horse, followed by Chance's alarmed barking. Jack was at the door in an instant, Katherine close behind him. Outside, a massive grizzly bear stood between them and Jack's horse, which had broken its tether and retreated to the edge of the clearing. Chance circled warily, barking furiously but keeping his distance. "Get back inside," Jack ordered, his voice low and urgent. "Now." "Your rifle is on your saddle," Katherine observed, her heart pounding. "And your horse is too far away." "I'm aware of that." Jack's eyes never left the bear, which had risen onto its hind legs, sniffing the air. "This is unusual. They should be hibernating by now." Must be desperate for food. The bear dropped to all fours and took a step toward the cabin. Inside, Jack repeated, "I'll try to reach my horse." "That's suicide," Katherine hissed. She glanced back into the cabin, making a quick decision. "My husband's rifle is above the fireplace. I've never fired it, but get it," Jack said. Quickly, Katherine darted inside, retrieving the rifle and the small box of ammunition beside it. Her hands trembled as she brought them to Jack. "Stay behind me," he instructed, loading the weapon with practiced ease. "If something happens, get inside and bar the door." The bear was moving closer now, its massive head swinging from side to side. Jack raised the rifle, sighting carefully. "I don't want to kill it unless necessary," he murmured. "A warning shot might scare it off." He fired into the air, the sound cracking across the clearing like lightning. For a heartbeat, the bear hesitated, startled by the noise. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the very ground, it charged. Everything happened with terrifying speed. Jack fired again, the bullet striking the bear's shoulder but not slowing its advance. Katherine screamed as the massive creature closed the distance, Jack barely diving aside in time to avoid its first swipe. Inside, Jack shouted, scrambling to his feet. "Now!" But Katherine couldn't move, frozen in horror as the bear rounded on Jack again. He had lost the rifle in his dive, and now stood with only a hunting knife drawn from his boot. In that moment, something snapped inside Katherine. The paralyzing fear vanished, replaced by a clarity she had never experienced. Without conscious thought, she darted to the fallen rifle, scooped it up, and aimed at the bear's broadside as it prepared to charge Jack again. The recoil nearly knocked her backward as she fired. The bear staggered, then turned toward her with murderous intent. Jack used the distraction to plunge his knife into the creature's flank. Roaring in pain and fury, the bear whirled back toward him. Katherine worked the rifle's lever action with shaking hands, aimed, and fired again. This time, her bullet found the bear's heart. The massive animal took 2 more staggering steps toward Jack before collapsing heavily into the snow. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then Jack was at her side, gently taking the rifle from her trembling hands. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes scanning her for injuries. Katherine shook her head, unable to speak. The reality of what had just happened, what had almost happened, crashed over her in waves. Her knees buckled, and Jack caught her against his chest. "I thought," her voice broke. "I thought I was going to watch you die." Jack's arms tightened around her. "You saved my life," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Katherine looked up at him, suddenly aware of their closeness, of the rapid beat of his heart against her cheek, of the way his eyes had darkened with an emotion she couldn't name. "I couldn't bear to lose you," she whispered, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. "Not you too." Something broke in Jack's expression then, some wall he had built around himself crumbling in the face of her words. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. But when Katherine responded, her hands sliding up to his shoulders, it deepened into something that felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally parted, Jack rested his forehead against hers. "I've been telling myself this couldn't happen," he admitted. "That caring for someone only ends in pain." "I've told myself the same," Katherine said softly. "That I was safer alone. Maybe we've both been wrong." Jack brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Maybe some things are worth the risk." A cold wind swept across the clearing, reminding them of their surroundings. The fallen bear, the approaching dusk, the coming storm visible in the darkening sky. "We need to get inside," Jack said. "And I need to take care of." He gestured toward the bear. "The meat will feed us both through winter, and the hide will make a fine rug. Us both." The casual phrasing sent warmth through Katherine's chest. "You'll stay tonight?" Jack nodded. "If that's all right. The storm's coming in fast, and there's work to be done here." "It's more than all right," she said softly. As Christmas Eve dawned, Katherine woke to the scent of coffee and the sound of quiet movement in her cabin. Jack stood at the stove, his back to her as he prepared breakfast. The domesticity of the scene made her heart ache with unexpected sweetness. The previous evening had been spent in labor, Jack skinning and butchering the bear, while Katherine prepared a stew with some of the meat. They had worked side by side until late, speaking little but exchanging glances that said more than words could. When exhaustion finally claimed them, Jack had insisted on sleeping on the floor beside the fire, respecting the propriety Katherine still valued despite the feelings growing between them. "Good morning," she said, sitting up and running a hand through her sleep-tousled hair. Jack turned, a smile warming his features. "Morning. Thought you might sleep longer after yesterday. Too much on my mind, I suppose." She accepted the cup of coffee he offered. "Thank you." They ate breakfast in companionable silence. Outside, snow fell steadily, transforming the landscape into a white wilderness that isolated them from the rest of the world. The bear hides stretched on the side of the shed, waiting to be properly tanned, and neat packages of meat were stored safely away from predators. "I should head back to my place," Jack said eventually. "Check on the livestock." Katherine nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course. But I was thinking." He hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Tomorrow's Christmas. I thought maybe you might want to spend it together. I could come back with some supplies, maybe even find a small tree to bring inside." The offer touched Katherine deeply. "I'd like that very much." Jack reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I've been alone every Christmas since my parents died. I'd forgotten what it was like to look forward to the holiday." "So had I," Katherine admitted. "Even when Michael was alive, he was so often away with the army. And after he died," she shook her head. "Christmas just became another day to get through." Jack's thumb traced circles on her palm. "Maybe this year can be different. For both of us." The hope in his voice matched the feeling unfurling in her chest. "I'd like that, Jack. Very much." When he left an hour later, Katherine stood in the doorway watching until he disappeared into the swirling snow. For the first time since arriving in Montana, the solitude of her cabin felt temporary rather than permanent, a pause rather than an ending. Christmas morning arrived with brilliant sunshine that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse of white. Katherine woke early, excitement fluttering in her chest like a bird taking wing. She had spent the previous day preparing for Jack's return, baking bread with the last of her flour, making simple decorations from pine cones and red berries, even hanging the mistletoe she'd found while gathering pine boughs. By noon, with no sign of Jack, her excitement began to fade. By mid-afternoon, worry had replaced it. The sky to the west had darkened ominously, promising another storm before nightfall. "He'll come," she told herself firmly. He promised. But as the short winter day waned toward dusk and the first snowflakes began to fall, Katherine was forced to accept that Jack wasn't coming. Something had happened, or perhaps he had simply changed his mind, retreated back behind those walls he'd maintained for so long. The disappointment cut deeper than she wanted to admit. She had allowed herself to hope, to believe that the connection between them might be strong enough to overcome the fears they both carried. Now, alone on Christmas with the wind rising outside her cabin, that hope seemed foolish. "It's better this way," she told herself, echoing the philosophy she'd lived by since Michael's death. Depending on others only leads to disappointment. Yet even as she said the words, she knew they no longer rang true. Something had changed within her. Jack had changed her, with his quiet strength and unexpected gentleness, with the way he looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice, with the risks he had taken to help a stranger who had arrived on his doorstep. The first sob caught her by surprise. Katherine pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to contain the emotion, but it was too late. Tears flowed freely as she sank into the rocking chair by the fire, all the loss and loneliness of the past years crashing over her at once. She was so lost in her grief that she almost missed the sound, a faint calling that might have been the wind, except that it shaped her name. Katherine rose, wiping her eyes as she moved to the window. Through the gathering storm, a figure appeared, leading a horse laden with bundles. Jack, covered in snow, a small pine tree strapped to his back. Katherine flung open the door. "Jack!" He staggered toward her, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "I'm sorry," he called over the wind. Trail was washed out. Had to find another way. She rushed to help him, taking the reins of his horse as he struggled toward the cabin with his burdens. Together, they managed to get the horse into the lean-to shelter beside the cabin and Jack inside, where he collapsed into a chair by the fire. "I thought you weren't coming," Katherine admitted, helping him remove his snow-crusted coat and boots. "I promised I would." Jack's voice was hoarse with exhaustion. "Wouldn't miss Christmas with you, Katherine. Not for anything." The simple declaration melted something inside her. You're half frozen. Let me get you some hot coffee. As Jack warmed by the fire, color gradually returning to his face, Katherine prepared a simple meal with the supplies he'd brought. Ham, potatoes, even oranges, a rare luxury on the frontier. I've never ridden through weather like that, Jack admitted, accepting the steaming mug she offered. But all I could think about was you here alone, thinking I'd abandoned you. I was worried something had happened to you, she said softly. Something did happen to me. Jack set down his cup and took her hands in his. You happened to me, Katherine Adler. And it's terrifying and wonderful all at once. Katherine felt tears spring to her eyes again, but for an entirely different reason. I know exactly what you mean. Jack stood, drawing her up with him. I brought you something else. Another Christmas gift. He retrieved a small package from his saddlebag, wrapped more carefully this time. Katherine unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small book of poetry, Tennyson, her favorite. How did you know? She whispered, running her fingers over the leather binding. You mentioned it once, when we were talking about books you missed from Boston. Jack looked almost shy. I sent away for it weeks ago. It finally arrived yesterday. The thoughtfulness of the gift, that he had listened so carefully, remembered something mentioned in passing, touched Katherine deeply. It's perfect. Thank you. Jack's eyes moved to something above her head, and a smile touched his lips. Mistletoe. Katherine blushed. I was feeling optimistic. His laugh was low and warm as he drew her closer. Good thing I didn't disappoint then. This kiss was different from their first. Unhurried, deliberate, a promise rather than a question. When they parted, Jack rested his forehead against hers, his hands gentle on her waist. I've been alone a long time, he said quietly. Told myself it was safer that way. But these past weeks with you, they've made me realize how empty that kind of safety is. I know, Katherine whispered. I've been hiding too. From loss, from risk, from life, Jack finished for her. He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. I don't want to hide anymore, Katherine. I want to build something real with you. A life, a future. If you want that too. Katherine studied his face in the firelight. This man who had ridden through a blizzard to bring her Christmas, who had taught her to split wood and survive a Montana winter, who looked at her now with such vulnerability in his eyes. I do want that, she said simply. More than anything. The smile that broke across Jack's face was like sunrise after the longest night. He kissed her again, then glanced at the small pine tree he'd brought, still leaning against the wall. Should we decorate our Christmas tree? The word held such promise. Together, they set the tree in a bucket of sand and decorated it with pine cones, red berries, and the single glass bird Jack had brought from town. When they finished, they stood back to admire their work. It's the most beautiful Christmas tree I've ever seen, Katherine said honestly. Jack slipped an arm around her waist. First of many, he promised. If you'll have me. Katherine turned in his arms, facing him fully. Jackson Baxter, are you proposing to me on Christmas Day? A hint of uncertainty crossed his face. Is it too soon? I know we haven't known each other long, but out here, we learn quickly what matters, she finished for him. And what matters to me is you. Yes, Jack. Yes, I'll have you. Joy transformed his features as he lifted her off her feet in an embrace that spoke of all the love he had kept carefully contained until now. When he set her down, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver band. It was my mother's, he explained. I've carried it with me all these years, never thinking I'd find someone I wanted to give it to. As he slipped it onto her finger, Katherine felt the last of her walls crumble. Here, in this cabin on the edge of wilderness, she had found what she had traveled so far to seek. Not just a home, but a heart to share it with. Spring came early to Montana that year, the snow retreating up the mountainsides by late March. The wedding took place in April, with the entire population of Eagle Creek in attendance. Jack and Katherine stood together beneath an arch of early wildflowers as the circuit preacher pronounced them husband and wife. Their two cabins had become one home over the winter months, Jack moving his belongings to Katherine's place, which was newer and sturdier, while maintaining his cattle operation from there. Together, they had weathered the remainder of the harsh season, learning each other's habits and histories, building a partnership that grew stronger with each passing day. As they welcomed guests to the celebration afterward, Martha Wilson embraced Katherine warmly. I had a feeling about you two from the start, she confided. Sometimes the good Lord sends exactly what we need, even when we think we want something else entirely. Katherine smiled, her eyes finding Jack across the gathering. He was speaking with several ranchers, but his gaze frequently returned to her, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. I came to Montana looking for a place to belong, Katherine told Martha. I never expected to find someone to belong to. Later, as they walked hand in hand back to their cabin, the bear hide now a rug before their hearth, Jack paused to look out over the land that stretched before them, his cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, the mountains still capped with snow against the blue sky. I never thought I'd share this place with anyone, he admitted. Convinced myself I was better off alone. Katherine squeezed his hand. And now? Jack turned to her, love plain in his eyes. Now I can't imagine any of it without you. You're the miracle I never thought to ask for, Katherine Baxter. As they continued toward home, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from Boston widow to Montana wife, from a woman determined to need no one to a woman who had found strength in loving and being loved in return. The frontier was still harsh, the challenges still numerous. But they would face them together, two people who had learned that the greatest courage sometimes lay not in standing alone, but in opening one's heart to another. That was the real miracle, not just for Christmas, but for all the seasons to come.